And thanks to everybody for joining in today. The topic today is a risk-based approach, which obviously requires knowledge of what are the hazards that you're going to face, and therefore what are you going to be able to do about it. If you don't know your hazards, then you're going to have obviously difficulty putting together a risk-based approach to handle those hazards. So I'm going to be talking about understanding hazards and risks, know how to control these risks, and ensure that your employees understand the consequences of their actions if they don't do what they need to do to put out a safe product. What has happened to us over the years is obviously regulators have got involved in telling manufacturers what to do. So one of the things I'm going to do is review what has happened in the past that caused regulators to suddenly come and start mandating things to the food processing industry, which they never would have done if the industry had been able to police itself. And so one of the things that we've had recently is obviously the Food Safety Modernization Act passed and implemented in the USA, and Safe Food for Canadians that has been implemented this year in Canada. Both of those, the regulators are now dictating much more to the industry what they're going to do, because the industry in a lot of cases has done it, but in not all cases has done it. And therefore, what have we learned in the past? What have we learned from the past? How much better are we today? What did it take to get food processors to face their challenges? So I'm going to have Adriana, first of all, do a little poll on what you feel is the pathogen that is most concerned to you.
Okay, we have the poll open now. We are going to wait a few seconds so you can select your answer. Okay, I'm closing the poll now. And Dr. Buff, we can see that Salmonella and Listeria are really close. It's 39% and 43%. And the other pathogen they are worried about is E. coli.
Okay. Well, thanks, Adriana. And maybe that's not surprising when you consider that when it comes to ready-to-eat products, then obviously one of our biggest concerns is Listeria monocytogenes. When we're concerned about environmental issues, when you're making ready-to-eat products, Listeria and Salmonella are the two. And when you consider E. coli tends to be more involved with the fecal material and meat products, you would tend that to be a little further down. Campylobacter is actually a big concern to us, and yet it's a very unreported bacteria as far as people getting sick, because the sicknesses tend to be milder, but a lot of chicken, raw chicken, has Campylobacter in it. So let's talk about what we've learned from the past and where we've had regulations put on us because of industries failing to do what they needed to do. I'm going to take you all the way back into 1971, when there was a company that was actually canning potato soup, Vichyssoise soup. And in the afternoon, the employees decided, having put a retort and started it, that they wanted to go home. So they just turned off the retort and went home. Obviously not understanding that you have to retort the product to where you get the Clostridium botulinum spores activated, and then you continue to process to kill them off. If you don't, then you're going to grow botulism in those cans. They were very lucky that it actually finished up with only one death, but it did finish up with a large recall, and that brand is not known today. And so what did this bring on the industry? On everybody who does canning. It brought on the low acid canning food regulations, which were mandated in the late 70s because the government decided that the industry didn't know what to do. They were going to tell the industry what to do. It required these facilities to register with the FDA. That's prior to now everybody has to register with the FDA if you're selling a product in the United States. process filing had to be filed with the FDA so that the FDA could look over your process and say whether it was adequate to be successful in canning a product and not have botulism problems. You had to post the process in the early days on the wall in the plant to remind your employees exactly what had to be done, when it had to be done, how it had to be done, and there could be no variations. They had to put things on the equipment so people couldn't shut off the retort. They couldn't under-process. They couldn't do something that would short-circuit the process. They made them go to school, which was called the Better Process Control Training, which is still available today, and it's something like a 4-day class. Now, I think a lot of that you can now do online, but you still have to do it if you're going to get into doing low-acid canned foods. The government brought this on the industry because the industry apparently was not understanding what they needed to do and could have killed a lot of people with botulism poisoning. A couple of years later, well, actually more than a couple of years later, 20 years later, we had what everybody talks about today, and that is an incident where hamburgers were undercooked in a restaurant. And these had E. coli 15787 in it. And the state actually warned this hamburger chain that they better raise the temperature of cooking their hamburgers from what was about 145 up to 155, because at 145, they would not be killing off E. coli. Senior management at that company at that time said, no, that'll affect the quality of the burger, which obviously you never put quality ahead of food safety. But in this case, they did. Lack of understanding by management of the deadliness of E. coli and the fact that a lot of children eat hamburgers and they are at a very vulnerable age. So what happened to after that? Well, unfortunately, 4 people died. 178 people got seriously ill, which means that they had some problems with their internal organs. The company lost $160 million over the next 18 months with their share value dropped tremendously. They had class action suits by a lawyer, a famous lawyer today, who actually launched his career based on this and is still in business today and still suing companies. And this is where he got his start. What did the government say? Well, in this case, we're going to mandate mandatory HACCP for meat and poultry. And this went into effect in 1999. And so therefore all USDA plants have to have mandatory HACCP. Before that, they could have voluntary HACCP, but they didn't have to have mandatory. But since 1999, they've had to have mandatory. Later, USDA even declared E. coli 15787 as an adulterant in ground beef. And therefore, if your product's out in the marketplace, it is a serious threat hazard to the consumer, even though you could say the consumer should cook the product properly. But the customer doesn't always do that. So therefore, you can't put out something on the understanding that the customer is going to cook it. So that's why we get very concerned about ready to eat, ready to heat, and sometimes raw, making sure the consumer understands when it is raw what they need to do. But the industry has to avoid that contaminant being there in the first place. So along comes mandatory HACCP for the meat and poultry industry. It wasn't too many years after that that unfortunately a company finished up killing a 27-month-old child by putting out unpasteurized apple juice in which they were picking up drop apples off the floor in the orchards and taking them into a plant and then not controlling the flume water as they flumed the apples in from the trucks, and therefore not making sure that there wasn't bacteria in that water, and then squeezing those apples and getting what's on the outside of the apple into the juice, not only getting whatever was inside the apple. And as they had decided not to pasteurize their juice, there was no heat step. A senior vice president overruled the plant's technical lead at that plant, where that person said, we need to be adding chlorine to this wash water. And the senior vice president said, no, it's going to affect the flavor of the juice. And they had already made a decision. They wanted to put out unpasteurized juices, which are more risky than pasteurized juices, obviously. And so here's management again, making quality decisions over food safety decisions. And we can't have that happen. And when it does happen, the government decides they're going to do something about it. Because in this case, they were lucky again. Only one child died. But there was a large recall of apple juice and other products, because sometimes they have products that have apple juice in them with other juices. They got a $1.5 million fine. That was the first time that the government had actually fined a company for putting out an unsafe product. That money actually got donated for research, but the company had to pay it. They then got sued for $12 million in lawsuits. They're lucky that that was only 12 million, because today I think each death is 10 million, plus the cost of lawyers, plus the cost of people who get sick. And that company changed ownership. Their name is still there, but they're no longer an independent company. They're now part of a larger company who actually bought them out because of the fact that they were able to buy them out. What did it bring for the rest of the juice industry? Mandatory labeling of unpasteurized juices. And if you go back to when this happened, you had to hang signs in grocery stores right where you actually had these unpasteurized juices displayed. And the signs had to warn the public of the dangers of drinking unpasteurized juices. We don't have to have those signs there now, because I believe the public is now aware of the fact that unpasteurized juices can be safe, but they can also be unsafe if the process is not being adequate. So what is adequate? Juice HACCP. So then we had juice HACCP mandated for all the juice industry, because this one company caused this to happen. Then you had to go to HACCP class for juice. So when the industry doesn't do what they're supposed to do because they don't understand their risks, and quite often this is management not understanding the risks, then they don't put into place processes that are adequate to control risks. So we keep coming back to, do you know what your risks are? Do you know what your hazards are? Do you know how to handle them? And remember, if you can't handle them, your supplier has to handle them, or you have to pass them on to the next person. Well, you can't pass them on to the next person when it's a consumer and this is a ready-to-eat product, which this juice is. We then had another problem with a company that was putting out sliced meats and hot dogs. What finished up here is, over the weekend of one weekend, the maintenance people came into the packaging room and they took out old cooling units. And the cooling units obviously had condensate in them, in the catch pans underneath. And in those catch pans was Listeria monocytogenes. And by disturbing it, they spread it around the room, and then he put in the new cooling units. But nobody realized that they need to now clean the entire room, because now you've got Listeria monocytogenes all in this room and you're packing off a ready-to-eat product. So again, management was oblivious to the fact that that action caused a major problem in that packing room. And that's why you can see why USDA and FDA and CFIA now require you to be doing environmental monitoring in the packing room when you're making ready-to-eat products. Because the bacteria doesn't just stay on the walls and the floors and in the drains, it gets airborne and then gets on the product you're packing. And there is no heat step coming later. People are taking these sliced meats and these hot dogs, taking them out of the package, and they're going to eat them. Now you say, well, most people buy the hot dogs on the grill, and that's true, but they are ready to eat. So then that's not necessarily always putting them on a grill. And therefore you have to assume somebody's going to eat the hot dog right out of the package. They're certainly going to eat the sliced meats. What did this result in? 22 deaths. A $4.4 million fine. 15 million pounds of product recalled. $2.5 million in renovations in that plant to get the listeria out of that room and to try to get them back into operation. That was such a drain on that company that, again, they were sold. And the name is no longer used on those products. They got some other name on them. Because management wasn't aware of what Listeria monocytogenes was. They obviously weren't aware that it could be in condensate water. They weren't aware that it could be in the packaging room now. And they weren't aware, obviously, it has a 20% mortality rate. 20% of people who get listeriosis die. 65% of people have to go to hospital and get put on IV drips. So it's not one of those pathogens where you go, well, maybe somebody's going to die, maybe a couple of people are going to die. No, this is a pretty deadly bacteria. So now what have we got? We got environmental swabbing now required under the new regulations that got into effect in the last couple of years. But unfortunately, even with that major problem, another company had the same problem not long after this, where they finished up with contaminated packaging lines. Now, the difference was this company now was in Canada instead of being in the USA. But it doesn't matter where they are. They can be anywhere in the world. And if they're not going to do things safely, not understand their hazards, not understand their risks, not have processes that are scientifically valid, and not understand the importance of sanitation, particularly in that packaging room when you're packaging off a ready-to-eat product that's exposed in that room, then I think we're going to head for another problem sometime in the future. I hope not. I hope we've learned, but I'm not sure we have. And remember, I'm talking in these cases, these were big companies. These weren't medium and small companies. So I do get a little bit more concerned that if the big companies didn't know the risks, do the medium and small companies know the risk? And if they do, are they adequately handling them? Because if not, then they're heading towards a possibility of a major recall, people sick, lawsuits, possibly being closed down, and possibly going bankrupt. These are the consequences. Because in this case, 22 large recalls on that Canadian plant. Public apologies because they're a leading company in Canada. This was harmful to their reputation, to their image. The good news is they learned a lot, and they're obviously where they need to be today, but they weren't where they needed to be then. They actually go around the country like the hamburger company does, and they've actually helped train other people and share their stories, which is great because you can learn from other people's mistakes. You just hope you're not the one who's having the mistakes and trying to help the rest of the industry. $20 million in lost production and cleanup, $27 million worth of lawsuit settlements. What did it bring? Well, CFIA at that time was talking about backing off their inspection frequency of meat plants in Canada. And they were very close to saying, we will just come and see you occasionally. But that changed. They realized they couldn't just come and see these meat plants occasionally. They have to be in there all the time, and they're high-risk products. It also meant CFIA has now set up requirements for other plants if you're going to move product across province lines, and if you're going to sell stuff outside of Canada, or you're going to import stuff into Canada, the Safe Food for Canadian Acts is based on this experience and based on the fact that the Canadians realize they better know what's coming in the country and they better make sure some regulator has oversight on all their manufacturing plants. The only difference in Canada is if you keep your product in a province, it's governed by the province government and not by the federal government in Canada. Now, therefore, if you're going to move product across province lines, or you're going to import or export, you now have to be licensed with CFIA, which is similar to where you have to be registered with the FDA in America. You also have to obviously be under the inspection of USDA if you're doing meat and poultry plants. So what has the industry brought on themselves? They brought on them the fact that the regulator is going to be looking over your shoulder now, much more than they were in the past. And they wouldn't have had to do that if they felt the industry was able to do what they need to do. So what have we learned? If you don't do it voluntarily, you don't do it right, the government comes in and tells you how to do it. This is one with a large peanut corporation, peanut product. And in 2008, they were storing peanuts in their plant. The roof was leaking, dripping water into the bags of peanuts, bringing salmonella in from bird droppings, increasing the amount of salmonella on the peanuts. And they felt obviously that the roaster would take care of all the problems. But that's only if the roaster has equal heat across the whole roaster. It's only true if you control the speed at which the peanuts go through the roaster. It's only true if you control the airflow through the roaster. And it's only true if you control the depth of the peanuts. So if you've ever gone to the PCQI training, that's one of the examples they use, is you're measuring 4 things here, not just the roaster temperature. They started to get positive salmonellas. Well, they were making so much peanut, they were making peanut butter, but they couldn't make enough to meet all of their customers, and they didn't sell a retail peanut butter, they just sold one as an ingredient. Well, they couldn't afford to throw any peanut butter away, and it's very difficult to rework peanut butter. So what do you do if you're not very ethical? You decide that you're going to change the lab analysis from positive salmonella to negative, send it out, and cause your customer a whole lot of costs. This one, therefore, is greed and dishonesty, which is not typical of the food processing industry. But what happened? What were the consequences of this? 9 deaths, 714 people sick. The plant closed. 5 people went to jail out of that plant. I think one of them's already out. One's about to come out. Another one will get out next year. But the 2 management people are in for 21 and 28 years. It's going to be a while before they get out. Massive recalls of their customers, not of their product directly, but where their product was used. Major lawsuits. So what did this result? This resulted in Congress in the United States saying, we've got to take action, and directing the FDA to obviously be more proactive, to get into plants and make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing before you have a problem. So do you have a more aggressive FDA now? Yes. And they've changed them from inspectors now to investigators. When they come to see you, quite often it's 3 or 4 regulators now, not 1. They're coming in to see if you're complying with the Food Safety Modernization Act, and then you got food safety plans. They want to make sure that what you're doing is scientifically valid, and you can tell them the validity of your process. You can tell them the validity of your calibrated instruments. You can tell them specifically which hazard, biological, chemical, or physical you're trying to control. And they even require you to have a PCQI, a Preventive Controls Qualified Individual, who now puts together your food safety plan, and not a HACCP person. The industry has brought this on themselves. And therefore, you now live in a different era than you did just back 5 years ago, because the Food Safety Modernization Act went into effect in 2016 for large companies, medium-sized companies in 2017, and smaller companies in 2018. But it applies to anybody selling product into the United States. So this has had an impact around the world in any other country that supplies products to the United States, whether it's a grower, whether it's a processor. And therefore, we have had to change, because obviously it doesn't matter who's selling unsafe products or where they were made. We don't want Americans getting sick. And we have had a tendency, unfortunately, in America to get people living here sick at the rate of 48 million a year. So it's about a 1 in 7 chance you've got to get them sick. And we actually been killing 3,000 people in America on food that appeared to be safe. But we're apparently still having issues. This is the issue that goes back just to 2011, where a farmer was growing cantaloupes, bringing them into a plant, and should have been removing the field heat out of them, but wasn't, and then had pooling water in the plant, and had ideal conditions for listeria to be in the plant and for it to be growing, and was using a piece of equipment that was designed to wash the gross soil off potatoes, but not designed to be washing cantaloupes. It even had a sanitizer ability to be added, and they discontinued using sanitizer. So now you had them washing warm cantaloupes in a facility with bad floors and pooling water, with listeria in there. And now we finish up with those products going out and being distributed. And we finished it with 33 people dead. Who would have believed that cantaloupes would have resulted in 33 deaths of consumers in the United States? 147 people sick. Well, now lawyers got involved. So who did they sue? The grower, 2 distributors, 2 of our largest distributors, 2 of our largest retailers, the auditing company and the auditor. Because when you think about it, if it's going to cost you $10 million to pay each family who lost a member, that's $330 million plus the cost of the people who got sick. You're heading for a $500 million lawsuit. So you can maybe understand why the lawyer decided to sue 2 distributors, because they have what they call the deeper pockets. The farmer went out of business. He gave up all of his money and family business they'd had for years. And he actually agreed to testify, if it was a court case, against the other people. Turned out that everything was settled out of court. But this is the largest foodborne illness ever reported in the United States. This and the peanut butter thing are 2 of the reasons why the FDA got into writing the Food Safety Modernization Act. But when we go back and we start looking at where we are now with regard to recalls, and obviously recall means you've got a product out there that is going to cause an illness or an injury to a consumer, and it's called a Class 1 or a Class 2 recall. The number 1 recall is still today allergens. Allergens not being on the label, but being in the product, meaning that they weren't supposed to be on the label because they weren't supposed to be in the product, but they're in the product because of cross contact. Or they are supposed to be in the product and you put the product in the wrong package. And we got people who get sick and in some cases can go into anaphylactic shock and die. And so you can't have a product out there with an allergen in it at any level in the United States and not have it result in a Class 1 recall. We don't have any tolerance levels. We don't have, if it's below this level, you can have this amount of allergen in it, even though the University of Nebraska has done studies to show at what level even allergic people are not, if you go below that level, they're not allergic. The FDA declined to use that scientific research. And so our standard in America is any one of the top 8 allergens in a product at any level, you've got a Class 1 recall. So I come back again, we'll do another little poll before we get ready to wrap up and start taking questions. So Adriana, if you could ask the second poll for me, please.
Yes, so after all of these explanations, which pathogen do you think is more difficult to control? We are going to leave the poll open for a couple of seconds. Okay, we're closing now. And most of the attendees here vote for Listeria. This is the pathogen they think is more difficult to control with 76% of the votes.
All right, well, thank you for that. And that doesn't surprise me again, particularly when the fact that some of you may be making a ready-to-eat product, and you have to be very concerned about that. You also, if you don't know more about Listeria, let me tell you a little about Listeria. Listeria is like you and me. It has DNA. So obviously all of us have DNA. Our DNA is specific to us unless you got a really close twin brother or twin sister. Well, Listeria is the same way. So when you think you got rid of Listeria out of your plants and the FDA comes in because you're having issues and they find Listeria in there and they find it's the same stereotype as what you had before, the answer is you didn't get rid of it. And you got to get rid of it, otherwise you're in danger of them possibly closing your plant down because you're making a ready-to-eat product, you're packing it up and it's exposed, and you can't be continuing to do that in that packaging room. So it is scary. It is something to worry about. And therefore, you want to make sure that you're finding it and getting rid of it. So what have we learned? We've learned that the government's going to mandate things on you if you don't do what you're supposed to do. So we've had the Food Safety Modernization Act. We've had seafood HACCP. We've had meat and poultry HACCP. We've had juice HACCP. We've had food allergen labeling. We've now got to where we've got to have food safety plans now for most products other than seafood, meat and poultry, and juice, and low acid canning is even covered. We had safe food for Canadians. So what are we learning? We're learning that the government is going to tell us what to do if we don't do it. And therefore, what we're going to be talking about in a minute is what's coming down the road, because this is not the end of regulations coming, unfortunately. What we've also learned is that lawyers are just waiting to take you to court. And the lawyer who's been very successful in America has now set up an office in Toronto and is now suing Canadian companies. And you can't blame him. And he does, if you ever listen to him talk, and he goes to food shows, and he'll say to you, put me out of business. It's a little tongue in cheek, because he knows that no matter how hard you try, some of you are going to fail, and he's going to be getting a class action suit, and he's going to be suing you. And in a lot of cases, that's the difference between you being here tomorrow in business and tomorrow gone. So I would say to you, yes, put out a safe product. Yes, be concerned about the regulations in your country, but be much more concerned about the lawyer who's going to take all your money. But the government ain't going to take your money. Yes, they find a couple of companies, but in most cases, they don't come after your money. They may close you down, which is certainly something you got to worry about. But lawyers come after you and take all your money, and it's big money. And therefore, what you don't want to do is get in trouble with a lawyer. You also don't want the regulators to prosecute you, and they're doing some of that. And just recently, we just saw the first case against a broker bringing a product in from the United States, which finished up having salmonella in it. And that's the first time a broker has actually been named in a government action. And so we know that the regulators in America, at least, are getting much more aggressive. But who are you making the product for? The consumer. So once you have something that's public, once you have something that upsets the consumer, you're losing their trust. And then they buy somebody else's product. And then they don't come back to buying your product later if they think that maybe it'll happen again with you. And when you have a recall, it's not a small amount of money. There's a large amount of money involved in having recalls. What we found out also is the FDA is now telling you you can't blame your supplier. And in fact, if you read all of the preventive controls for human foods and all of the background information on it, it tells you that you are now responsible for your suppliers. And if you don't control your suppliers and they send you a hazard that you can't control, you're going to be held by the regulators liable for that hazard. So if you're not controlling your suppliers and not getting third-party audit reports and not getting valid analysis, then you're liable. And therefore, be careful where you're buying. Ensure that your food safety management system is in writing, because the regulators are now saying if it isn't in writing, no matter how much you want to tell me about it, no matter how much you want to explain it to me, I'm going to assume as a regulator you ain't doing it. I want to see it in writing, then I want to talk to you about it, then I want to see records, and now in the United States, you can take all your plan, you can take all your records as a regulator, and I can walk out of the plant with it. If it's good, the chances are they ain't going to do that. So when they start walking out with your records and your plan, they're going to get a second opinion. They're going to be coming back if the second opinion says that things aren't where they need to be. Your name's on the label. So therefore, you have to be aware of the fact that with that comes the responsibility. The product in that package better be safe, better not have harmful bacteria in it if it's ready to eat, better not have an allergen missing on the label. And if you're going to be the FSVP importer, and we have a class on that, then basically what I'm saying to you is you have to make sure that you understand you're responsible for that plant, that grower in that foreign country, if you are the FSVP importer. CDC is collecting data that allows for quicker identification of contaminated food. So it's not like you basically can say they will never catch me. In the past, that's true. If you actually would put out an unsafe product, and I may go back only 10 or 15 years, the chances are it was very difficult for the regulators to trace that product back to your plant. They can do it in days now. They can also tell you the whole genome sequencing of that pathogen. And once they find that same pathogen, that same species, that same DNA, there's no way you can't say that it didn't come from your plant. And particularly if they got it from a food, they got it from a stool sample, they got it from the environment in your plant. And when you say you got rid of it, and then they find it again, you can't say it came back in. It never came back in, it never left. Yeah, you can bring in another one of its brothers and sisters, another Listeria, and you have to talk about that. But you can't say the original one left if you can find it there later. So what have we learned? We've also learned that sometimes these things do not solve all the problems. Because in 2007, we had somebody who under-processed canned chili sauce. Yet the regulations were in effect since the 70s. Everybody was supposed to have gone to school. They were supposed to have checks and measures on their equipment that nobody could under-process product. But they let the maintenance of the equipment go down, if you read the story on it. And they started cutting corners. They're lucky again, they didn't kill a whole lot of people. The leading cause is still allergen mislabeling. Listeria comes in the second largest recall. Salmonella is right behind it. So I think when we did those polls, you did identify Listeria and Salmonella as the two biggest things you were concerned about. You finished up saying, I'm more concerned about Listeria than I'm Salmonella. That's understandable, except both of them do give you a class 1 recall. The difference is Listeria has a mortality rate of about 20 to 25%, and Salmonella has a mortality rate of about 5%. Now, don't get that I said you can have a little Salmonella in your product. I didn't say that. We have learned, but I'm not sure everybody's learned, that you've got to have solid food safety plans. You've also got to have a solid food safety culture, which starts at the top, goes down to the lowest person in your facility and all the way back in, and everybody buys into food safety. Everybody realizes they have a role. Everybody's doing what they need to do. If not, you could be tomorrow's headlines. Because the days are not getting found are gone. And with social media, sometimes that's more damaging than 6 o'clock news or the newspapers these days, that somebody says something about your product, about getting sick on it, and the next minute a whole lot of other people are going, ooh, I'm not going to buy that product. I'm not going to eat that product. I think social media is much more dangerous to you today if you're having problems. It can also be good. I can say, well, I enjoyed your product. Have you ever tried this product? And people can tout your products, which is good. What you want them to do is say positive things about you. You can't hide anymore because the regulators will be at your plant within a couple of days. And they will be looking to see if that harmful bacteria, whatever was in that product that caused the person to complain, that they can find it in your plant. So what's ahead of us? What is still to come that we should be thinking about? And then we'll get into questions and answers. Obviously, if you're not aware, the Intentional Adulteration Act went into effect just a month ago for large companies. That's the food defense. And if you haven't gone to that class and seen what that involves, it is very, very detailed on what your food defense plan has to look at. And I will tell you, most companies that I've looked at their food defense plan, it is nowhere near where the FDA wants it to be. Now, for those of you who are smaller, you got another year. For those who are really small, you're going to be exempt, but you have to prove you're exempt. Food fraud's coming down the road. The FDA is indicating that they're going to come in and want to see your food fraud programs. They haven't told us exactly what needs to be in there, but they've told us you should be working on. We know they're looking at use by, sell by, and best by dates. And once they get all the comments from everybody and sort through them, they're going to decide that one of those is going to be used for food safety, and you'll be able to use that for food safety. Another one's going to be used for quality, and only for quality, and the third one's going. So keep in tune with that, and we will try our best to keep you up to date on that. There is no definition for natural. So the FDA right now is taking comments on what do we mean by natural, and then they'll formulate a law, and then you won't be able to use the word natural if it doesn't meet those definitions. We obviously are aware that added sugar warning has to go on labels now. So therefore we're very concerned, or the government is very concerned, and maybe dietitians are very concerned about people getting too much sugar. Therefore, they're saying you need to warn people what sugar you're adding. They're now saying your nutritional claims, you have to have proof for them and records, and the records have to be indelible. I wasn't sure what indelible meant, but what it means, it cannot be altered. Once the record is made, there is no way for you to alter it, go in a computer and change it, or do anything to it. We've seen the FDA just put out voluntary guidelines, and we did do a webinar on that, on bioengineered. So what we're talking about, GMO. And these are voluntary labels right now. But obviously we're aware that what's voluntary today may not be voluntary 5 years from now or 10 years from now. The FDA is going to come out with some traceability requirements on where you can trace things one back and one forward, and they're going to tell us how we're going to have to prove to them we can do that. We've got to do a much better job in defining shelf life, because we're throwing away, if you read some articles, more food in the United States than we actually consume, which is tragic when you think of the people who are starving, not only in America and Canada, but also in the rest of the world, that we're throwing away more than we're eating. And that's because people throw it away when it says best by, use by, or sell by, and that's, in most cases, is a quality issue, not a food safety issue. So we got about 10 plus minutes for questions and answers. So what type of questions do we have, Adriana?
Okay. One question is, retailers in my community are reluctant to ask for food safety compliance documentation because locally grown produce is generally on short supply. As a result, local small farmers are not motivated to comply with FSMA. Who is responsible for enforcing supplier compliance for the buyer?
That's a very good question, because obviously small farmers are exempt. So therefore, if it's a small farmer and he's selling something like 50% of his product within 250 miles of his farm, he is exempt. And so when you're talking local farmers, they are exempt. So you say to yourself, who's liable? You're liable if you're a retailer, because the consumer assumes that the product is yours because it doesn't have any national brand label on it. So therefore, if it's a fruit or a vegetable or a lettuce or something that's in your store, it'll be associated with your store. This will make you liable. Now you say to yourself, well, I can't get the farm to follow the produce food safety guidelines, which are part of FSMA. Well, then you have to decide whether you want to buy from them. Now you got another choice. You can go over and visit them. You can encourage them. You may want to give them financial support to do what they need to do. And then you'll feel a lot more confident that when you're buying from them, they are doing what they need to do, even though by law they don't have to do it. It's up to you. The risk is with you. And that's the whole purpose of FSMA, to have manufacturers, retailers, anybody understand the risk is with you if your name is on the product. And in the case of produce, there's nobody else's name on the product.
Okay, so the next question is, are the regulations for FSEP accepted in USA by FDA, which includes all these new changes?
Yeah, because FSVP stands for Foreign Supply Verification Program. So that means every product coming into the United States from anywhere, whether it's coming across the border from Canada or Mexico, whether it's coming in on a ship, whether it's coming in on a plane, all has to have Customs and Border Protection paperwork. And on that paperwork has to be a Dun & Bradstreet number, and every company has a Dun & Bradstreet number. Every company has to be registered with the FDA. Once that number is put on the paperwork, then whoever's Dun & Bradstreet number that belongs to is now legally responsible for the safety of that product being grown in those foreign countries, being farmed or fished in those foreign countries, or it's being manufactured in those foreign countries. And what you have to do is you have to either get a third-party audit report every year, or you've got to get a lab analysis done by the lab and sent directly to you, or you need to go visit those facilities yourself and do a second-party audit report. So be real careful that any product coming in the United States doesn't have your Dun & Bradstreet number against it, because legally that makes you responsible for it. And even if they're bringing in 1,000 pounds of something and you're only using 200 pounds of it, you're legally responsible for all 1,000 pounds of it. Go to that class if you are going to be the FSVP importer. We teach that class, and so do other people. I would encourage you to go to that class if you are going to be an FSVP importer, because again, you need to know your risks.
Okay, the next question is, if in a canning facility you have the resort to control the Clostridium, which pathogen should a canning facility looking for the environmental monitoring program?
Don't worry about it. If you're canning something, the canning process, the heat will kill anything that was in there. So therefore, Listeria, Salmonella, or anything that was in that can, that got in the can before you sealed it, will be killed by the heat, and it won't get in there afterwards. So don't worry about that. What they did ask canning operations to do, seeing the original regulation in the 70s only addressed Clostridium botulinum, they said to the canners, don't forget allergens, which we didn't know were a problem until 1990, that they have to be on the label, or otherwise you're heading for a class 1 recall. They also said, don't forget about physical contaminants that could be in the can, because those weren't addressed in the law back in the 70s. And that's the only thing that low acid canning regulations had to add under FSMA, was they had to add the fact that they were going to consider allergens and they were going to consider foreign materials.
Next question is, if we are a food manufacturer but do not own our own facility and act through private label contractors, how do we include an EMP for our allergen program?
Well, again, you're not liable for the packaging materials that are sent to you by a supplier, where the supplier has basically printed the label. What you have to do is, ethically, you have to look at what they printed on that packaging material that they're sending to you, and seeing you're making the product, go back to them and say, hey, your packaging material doesn't match the product we're putting in the package, so I don't think you want us to pack the packaging in this with this ingredient statement. even though legally they're responsible for it, you have a moral responsibility and ethical responsibility to tell them your ingredient statement doesn't match the product we're putting in the package.
As a breeding company that doesn't have a kill step in the process, should we state on the bag or box ready to heat?
Well, it's up to you. Most products that are ready to eat are clearly ready to eat. I'm not sure you want to say ready to eat, but if it is ready to eat, you better make sure you're meeting the ready to eat regulations, which means what it is, ready to eat, and the consumer's going to take it out of the package and eat it. So in that case, if it is ready to eat, then you better be doing the environmental swabbing. It is not something that is nice to do. You have to do it. The only difference between the USDA and the FDA right now is you don't have to swab the food contact surfaces for the FDA. They're strongly advising that, and they may change that. Now, you go up to CFIA in Canada, you are allowed to have a little listeria in a product, and they quote it in the CFIA regulations, if your product won't support the growth of listeria. So it's not quite as strict as in America. But if it will support the growth of listeria, you can't have anything in there. Now, all of you can get out of trouble if after you've packed your product, you're going to do something to kill listeria, like high-pressure pasteurization, or you're going to basically do some ultrasound or some type of treatment, put a listericidal agent in there, but most people are not. Then if you can prove that any listeria in your ready-to-eat product will be killed before the consumer eats it, then you do have an option not to do the environmental swabbing. But in most cases, companies won't have another way out of that problem.
The question was with heat, not eat.
With heat?
Yes.
Well, yeah, if you're going to kill, I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question. If you're going to kill something off with heat, then just make sure that it does, and make sure that you are not contaminated. So the answer is, if you've got a heat step and you're packing off a ready-to-eat product in a packaging room, the heat step got rid of the pathogen, but it didn't stop it getting back in, so you still have to do the environmental monitoring.
Okay, we are going to answer a few other questions. Another one is, can we take allergen declaration on the label as CCP? If yes, how determine the upper and lower limits?
Well, the answer is, and repeat that question again so I get it totally right.
What would be the best practical way? No, sorry. Can we take allergen declaration on the label as CCP? If yes, how determine the upper and lower limits?
Well, first of all, there are no upper and lower limits. Any allergen in any product that's not on the label, irrespective of how much or how little of it, is a class 1 recall. The second thing is that it's called an allergen prevented control, not a CCP. A CCP is a process prevented control, which is generally a heat step, a metal detector, something like that. So you're going to have to make sure you use the right terminology when you're talking to a regulator. In the case of food safety plans, it's an allergen prevented control, and there is no upper or lower limit. It's either there or it's not there. And if it's there, it has to be on the label. Now, you say, well, what if I say made in a plant that also packs peanuts? That's up to you. Or you say used on equipment that also handles peanuts. That's up to you. But if you think it's likely to have a trace of the other allergen in there that's not supposed to be on the label, then if you're an ingredient manufacturer, you legally have to now say may contain. And I don't want to get up into the whole thing. I could go for 20 minutes on that. So be real careful how you're labeling things if you say it's not really there, but it may be there.
Okay, and next question is, we are importer food from all countries. How can we control if a product came with a foodborne illness?
That's because you need to know from where it's coming, and you have to make sure they've got good food safety plans, and you have to make sure that they've got a good third-party audit report. And if you want to do analysis, you've got to do analysis. So in other words, the ball's in your court, Mr. Importer, And you have to understand your risk. You're the one that the FDA is coming to visit. You're the one that the FDA is going to say to you, you have to control your supplier. You don't get a pass. You don't get, well, I don't know how to do that. I trusted them, that type of thing. So be real careful. It has opened up Pandora's box for brokers to be in trouble with the FDA and maybe with lawyers.
Okay, and our last question. What would be the best practical way to convince senior management about the importance of food safety and relevant culture?
Just quote some of the examples I've given them. Keep in touch with the FDA recall list. Keep in touch with the USDA recall list. Keep in touch with CFI's recall list. Put examples like that in front of your bosses and say, look what happened. The Grocery Manufacturers Association has estimated that even the smallest recall can be $3 million. The average recall is about $10 million, and a big recall can be up to $100 million. Obviously, I don't think some of the people on the line have that amount of business that they would be causing those problems. But recalls are not cheap. Regulatory action is not something you want. You don't want the regulators coming to your plants and living with you for several days.
Okay, so that was our last question. Thank you, Dr. Buff, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. We are going to send you the information between today and tomorrow. And have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.